Today we're unboxing a first generation iPad Air that should be running its original software version, iOS 7. I picked this up on eBay for around $40. So let's go ahead and get it opened up. And here is the iPad. This is in a very protective case. So we'll pull this off now so we can take a look at the true condition of the device. And there we go. At least with the front panel, this device is looking amazing so far. And there we go. The device gets pretty much ruined with this engraving on the top panel. So I just double checked the listing that I purchased and it made absolutely no mention of the engraving. But it also didn't have a picture of the device without a case on it. So although that engraving is kind of depressing, we'll still power on the device and see if it is indeed running iOS 7. And yes, we do boot into the iOS 7 slide to unlock screen. So let's slide to unlock now. And yes, we can definitely tell this is iOS 7 also from the home screen. iOS 8 had an iBooks application by default on the home screen, and it also had a folder here called Extras. Let's head into settings and see which version of iOS 7 we have. Okay, looks like we have 7.1.2 here. That was actually the last revision of iOS 7 released in early 2014. And we can also see that this is a 32GB model. So this would have cost $599 when new. So this first generation iPad Air was released in October 2013. And it brought a major redesign to the iPad that was much thinner and lighter than the previous model, as the name implies. This was the second major redesign to the full-size iPad. The fourth generation iPad that was released just 1 year prior was using a design that we had seen since the 2011 iPad 2. And this 2013 iPad Air design was pretty much just a blown up version of the iPad mini design that we got in 2012. So it had more rounded corners than the previous iPad that had more of a tapered edge. And it had this really impressive detail that Apple called diamond chamfered edges. The left and right bezels in portrait orientation were significantly reduced on this iPad. It had the same 9.7-inch Retina display as before, but the narrower bezels as well as more rounded design really made this more comfortable to hold in the hand. So while this wasn't intended to be a one-handed tablet, of course, it was certainly more comfortable to use it with one hand than the previous iPad 4. It weighed only 1 pound, and Apple actually compared the thinness of this to a pencil. This was the first 64-bit iPad along with the iPad mini 2. It was powered by a dual-core Apple A7 chip clocked at 1.4 GHz. It included 1 GB of RAM, the same amount as the 4th generation iPad. Strangely though, this iPad did not receive the Touch ID fingerprint sensor on the home button like the iPhone 5S had. The display on this iPad was not laminated, nor did it have an anti-reflective coating, so it was definitely really reflective. Those downfalls were addressed with the 2014 iPad Air 2, however. This general iPad design would become very popular for future Apple products. It was slightly revised in 2017 and introduced as the 5th generation base model iPad. And it continued all the way through the 9th generation iPad that was just discontinued in 2024. Although it was more heavily redesigned in 2019 with the 7th generation iPad that got a larger screen. And now we'll turn our attention to iOS 7 on this iPad specifically. iOS 7 was one of the biggest redesigns that iOS has ever seen. Comparing iOS 7 to iOS 6 released just 1 year prior here, you can see that these were using two total different design philosophies. iOS 6 was very skeuomorphic, where these digital objects mimic real life ones, while iOS 7 had a much more flat and modern appearance. iOS 7 had a parallax effect on the home and lock screens. So when tilting the device, the wallpaper slightly moves to give the appearance that the applications are floating. It brought an all-new multitasking interface where you would get full screen previews of your applications. And closing them out was as easy as swiping up. It introduced Control Center, which was available with just a swipe. It brought useful features like AirDrop and iCloud Keychain, and this was the first version of iOS where devices could be activation locked if iCloud was left logged in with Find My iPhone on. iOS 7 was a bit criticized on the iPad as it didn't bring any real powerful multitasking functions. So you didn't have any sort of split screen or slide over multitasking. That would come later in iOS 9. Let's take a look at the default wallpapers included here on iOS 7. So you had these dynamic wallpapers that would provide moving dots according to the tilt of your device. And you had a really fantastic selection of still wallpapers. There were 28 here to choose from, and I pretty much think each one of these looks fantastic. Aside from iOS 8, this is my favorite stock wallpaper selection on any version of iOS. Of course, this space wallpaper was the default, but you had plenty of other really amazing choices. I've always really enjoyed the look of this wood design wallpaper, as well as these multicolored specks. This iPad would receive software support all the way through iOS 12 in 2018. And performance on this iPad with iOS 12 is just okay. The 1GB of RAM really began to hold it back with later iOS versions. So that pretty much concludes my look at this first generation iPad Air running iOS 7.1.2. I was pretty excited to receive this one, but I have to admit I'm really bummed about the engraving on the back. I know it's not really a big deal as I'm not going to be looking at that most of the time, but I really like for my devices to look factory fresh and perfect, so that engraving bothers me quite a bit. Be sure to get subscribed if you want to see more legacy iOS devices running their original software versions. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.